Hi again, Professor Rick Rapetti here, and this lecture is my post-Socratics lecture 2.3 of 2. So it's the final and third sub-lecture in my three-part second lecture. My first lecture of 2 of post-Socratics, once again, was on the Epicureans and the Stoics. That was post-Socratics lecture 1. And then post-Socratics lecture 2 has 3 separate lectures that are subparts of the rest of the post-Socratics. 2.1 was the Cynics, 2.2 was the Neoplatonists, and this one now is 2.3. The third segment of lecture 2 of 2 on, this one is on Christianity. Okay, so just like the other 2, each one of these smaller lectures has an embedded video in it from YouTube, right, on the topic of the lecture. And so I have to do some screen sharing to first show you my PowerPoint, and then shows you the link to the YouTube video. And then I have to stop that share and open up a new share, open up the YouTube video, let you watch it. I'll just sit there quietly on the side up in the corner of your screen, looking at you to see if you're paying attention, because I can see through your camera. I have that kind of technology. No, I don't. I'm just kidding. And then when that video is over, that YouTube video, I will stop that screen share and screen share again back to my PowerPoint, where I will lecture a little bit longer because there's some more interesting things that come up in this topic, Christianity, believe it or not. And why am I doing Christianity only instead of Christianity and Judaism and Islam? I guess I could talk about that later. I hope I remember. If not, email me and ask me. I'll say briefly right now, the Christian era that we're about to talk about was continuous with the Neoplatonic and the Cynics and the Socratics, the Platonics, and so on, right? So there's a kind of, from Aristotle too, also right up through the history of the church. Plato and Aristotle played, incredibly large roles in that history. Now, they also played those roles in later Judaism and later Islam, right? But those happened after the ancient period, right? So that's really the explanation for why I'm gonna talk about Christianity, but not Judaism and Islam, even though both of the later developments in Judaism and Islam itself are significantly influenced by Plato and Aristotle. And in fact, the Western philosophical tradition owes very much to the Arabs and the Muslims, who inherited the bulk of texts from Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greeks when they were no longer around, because the Catholics burned them all. They burnt the greatest library in the history of the world, more than one, the libraries of Alexandria, right? Because they were all pagans and non-Christians. So this is a problem. There's been a history of the church being hostile towards philosophy. All right, but ironically, the Muslim philosophers embraced Plato and Aristotle, and the Western world rediscovered them through Arabic and Muslim writings. Thank goodness. All right, I'll say that about it. We learned a tremendous amount from them. We got the number 0 and Arabic numerals. And let me tell you, we couldn't do math with Roman numerals. Have you ever tried to do division with X, X, V, I divided by V, I times CLXXXVII? Forget about it. So Roman numerals, that was one of the limitations on the Romans, right? They couldn't do math. I mean, they did pretty good engineering, but without math. But imagine what they could have done if they had access to Arabic numerals. All right, so much for the small talk. Let me open up my PowerPoint and get started here. So once again, you will see all three of the lectures that constitute lecture 2 of 2 start with the same page. Post-Socratics, lecture 2, point something out of 2. All right. That might look weird, but when you're reading in a book, you got to section 2. Underneath it, you'll have section 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. And then when 2 is done, you get to section 3, right? So this is the same thing here. All right. Only difference is, to remind you, Post-Socratics had 2 complete lectures. The first one, once again, was the Epicureans and the Stoics. Second lecture has 3 parts. Part 1, 2.1 out of 2. What's wrong with my brain? The Cynics, 2.2 out of 2. The Neoplatonists, and now 2.3 out of 2, Christianity. And when we're done with Christianity, we will be done with Western philosophy in the ancient world. Okay? And then after that, where do we go? To Asia. We will begin in India. And there's an awful lot of philosophy in India. You've got Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and all sorts of isms over there and subdivisions between them. And then after that, we go to China, where we have Taoism and Confucianism. All right, so let's move on. Let me turn the page here. And so there's the link to remind you, once again, just like in the other 2 videos that are part of this 3-part video series, which is lecture 2, parts 1, 2, and 3, right? This one is about, oh, look, I've got Neoplatonists appearing there all of a sudden in parentheses. So yeah, this lecture is about Christianity, but the first several centuries of Christianity were tremendously Neoplatonic, right? They were tremendously influenced by Neoplatonism. And we're going to, that link, by the way, when you want to go back and study this for your next exam, I guess by the time you see this, the next exam for you will be the final exam or your quiz. You come to this page in the PowerPoint, and you can click on that. If you don't want to watch my whole lecture again, you can just go watch that video, right? But now I'm going to stop the screen share so I can go to the YouTube page that I already have opened up and share that with you otherwise. And this is from a Catholic source. So no, we're not making this stuff up, as you'll see the name when it comes up here.
Hello there. When we come back, Plato, his philosophical legacy, and the massive influence he had on Catholic theology, mostly for good, but not always.
Pretty cool graphics, you know? CDU, a global Catholic university. I told you it was Catholic. Yeah.
When you're doing any kind of theology in the Catholic tradition, the first place to look should always be the Bible itself. Do we find any signs of Platonism at work there? I think we do. But what are we looking for? Well, for some kind of evidence for the belief that what we see here on earth is but a pale reflection, a shadowy image of the real heavenly thing. Remember Plato's metaphysics. There's a far greater, more important reality that we don't see than the one that our senses tell us is there. Let's look first at Paul. He tells us Adam is a type of Jesus Christ. Typology is Platonistic. It assumes an imitator Adam who is an image of the archetype Christ. Adam is a founder of the human race. Adam affects the destiny of many, but in this, he is a power reflection of Christ because he is the father of all who will die, whereas Christ is the father of all who live. Paul speaks in Galatians 6 of an unseen Jerusalem, a Jerusalem which is above. This Jerusalem is, of course, a better and eternal home for God's children than the earthly city, which is a mere mock-up of the true one in heaven. Take another example. Some people teach that we call God Father because we are drawing from an analogy from human fathers. But this is incorrect. Listen to what Paul says about God the Father in Ephesians 3:14. I kneel before the Father from whom every father in heaven and earth derives his name. Wow, the true archetype father is God. My dad is more like a father since he only approximates the true father, God. Human fatherhood is a metaphor for God's fatherhood, not the other way around. Paul's epistemology, or understanding of knowledge, has shades of Plato too. Notice how he describes what we know in the present age in 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a glass darkly. Here we picture looking through a dingy, dusty window with bad lighting. We can see some things, but only dimly, much like people in Plato's cave. But unlike the people in the cave, we are aware of the limits of our knowledge. We are also aware that when we complete our journey, our knowledge will be perfected when we see God, the knower of all things, face to face. If we move to the Gospels, listen to the words of Jesus himself in the Gospel of John when he discusses earthly things and heavenly things with Nicodemus in John 3. Earthly childbirth is but a pale reflection of the real birth that a person needs when he is born from God, born from above. Water that the woman at the well sees is but a figure of the heavenly water that Jesus brings, while the physical manna that Moses gave is but an anticipation for the true manna that Jesus gives. Earthly things like childbirth, water, and manna are but pale reflections of their heavenly counterparts. The most blatantly Platonistic part of the gospel, and indeed probably the whole New Testament, is seen in John 1:1, that Jesus Christ is the eternal Logos of God. The Logos was the thing all philosophers sought, going back to Heraclitus. It is translated word, but in fact it has dozens of meanings impossible to capture in a single English term. It means the principle of intelligibility, what makes something, in this case the world itself, make sense, what makes it understandable and meaningful. It also connotes the wisdom and understanding by which we can understand the world. And finally, it refers to word, by which we can communicate the knowledge and understanding truly. But for John, this logos was not simply an abstract set of ideas that we can understand and articulate. It was a person who became incarnate and came into the world as a man. The logos, long sought after by Plato, could be found only in Jesus Christ. But this eternal logos could not be discovered by philosophical means. This is why John tells us that the true light that enlightens everyone was coming into the world. To receive the true logos, one needed illumination from God. Probably the first of the church fathers to understand the gospel in these terms was Justin Martyr. Justin began a quest for logos as the lover of Platonic forms, believing contemplation of them would lead him to God. But then he happened upon an old man near the Syrian seashore who spoke to him of the God of the universe, whose prophets had written of things fulfilled in his Jesus, his Messiah. Justin soon after was baptized, experiencing the illumination which the old man had spoken of. He donned a philosopher's robe and went from place to place teaching the gospel as the true philosophy. Justin even went so far as to contend that men like Socrates and Heraclitus had as much wisdom as they had because they were in contact with the divine Logos, Jesus Christ, before he became incarnate. His conversion is itself an archetype for the great many other conversions which began as a philosophical quest for truth and wisdom and ended with an embrace of Jesus Christ as the embodiment of that wisdom. St. Augustine's Platonism is probably the most influential and consequential for the Catholic Church, at least in the West. So profound was Augustine's Platonism that many scholars claim that after he was baptized by Ambrose, he was converted to Neoplatonism first, before he started reading St. Paul closely and then became a Christian. This is an exaggeration, but not without a large kernel of truth. Augustine probably never read Plato himself, but knew his ideas mostly through the philosopher Plotinus, who is usually described as a Neoplatonist. Augustine developed from a strongly hierarchical view of the world. Heaven is greater than the earth, the supernatural is greater than the natural, the soul is greater than the body, the spiritual is higher than the material, etc. Augustine agreed with the strong distinction in Platonic thought between the eternal realm above and the temporal realm below. His understanding of human knowledge was also broadly Platonic. Knowledge is a thing of the human soul, not a thing of the senses, wherein lie only opinion and uncertainty. Knowledge takes place where the soul is illuminated with pre-existent wisdom, in a kind of aha moment. Now, these ideas were so powerful and useful for Augustine and for the church because they fit well with the New Testament. When Paul says flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God, or Jesus says a man must be born again or born from above, or when we read in John's gospel that Jesus is the light of the world who comes to illuminate every person, aren't they presupposing the separation between the eternal and the temporal realms? Aren't they telling us that we need the supernatural help from above called grace to reach the eternal? What Augustine saw was that the gospel provided the means for humans to achieve the Platonic goal, eternal contemplation of God in heaven. Augustine also solved what was a vexing metaphysical problem for the Platonists. Where were the forms or ideas that were at the heart of Plato's understanding of the world? Did they not exist in the material world or purely in the human mind? Take, for instance, the truth, 1 + 1 = 2. This didn't exist only in Augustine's mind or in the other students' minds or in the teacher's mind. It can only be discovered in the human mind, but is not an idea that originates in the human mind, nor does it require the human mind to think it. It is an idea that transcends all of them. It would be no less true if there were no one to think it. Where is this idea? It cannot be in material things or in physical space. An idea implies a thinking mind to think of it, and Augustine identified this mind with the pre-incarnate Logos, Jesus Christ, before he became man. But of course, the Logos is not merely a repository for previously homeless Platonic ideas. The Logos is a person with an intellect and a will of his own. And therefore, to think ideas, especially ideas that follow the supernatural illumination of baptism, is to experience communion with God himself through the Logos. Now, not all of Plato's influence on Christian teaching was so salutary. Plato taught rightly that the material world is lower than the spiritual world and that the body is lesser than the soul. But the danger in practice is that this view can slide easily into a denigration of the material world and the human body. Now, although none of the church fathers went into full-blown Gnostic or Manichaean teaching that the body is evil or that the material world is an illusion, shades of this teaching are to be found in some of them. For instance, in the writings of Origen, we find that he used Neoplatonic thought to interpret man's fall in Genesis 3 as that of the human soul's falling into bodies as a kind of punishment. Now, for Origen, the body was still good, but only in the sense that crutches are good, as a concession to man's fallen nature. The goal was to escape from the body. Likewise, many of the church fathers believed that sexual intercourse was only itself a result of the fall of Adam and Eve. How would Adam have been expected to be fruitful, you ask? Simply by speaking offspring into existence, just like God had spoken Adam into existence. Now that's some platonic relationship for you. In fact, Augustine was probably the first church father to teach that sexual intercourse was part of God's original plan for humankind. Before Adam's sin, sex would have been infinitely better, in fact, since men and women would have been able to give themselves more fully and be completely in control of their bodies. Another negative effect of Christian Platonism is a bit more subtle, but no less serious. There is a great beauty in presenting the gospel as the fulfillment of the deepest longings of Plato and his followers. But the danger in this is allowing the hope of Plato to obscure the hope of Israel. These two hopes are not exactly the same thing. Plato and Plotinus longed for a spiritual ascent to contemplate Logos eternally, freed from the confines of a human body. Jews like Jesus and Paul longed for a restoration of Israel, a vindication of God's people, and a new heavens and new earth in which Israel's God would reign over a humanity freed from the power of sin and death. The resurrection of Jesus was the first installment of this and was to be followed by the resurrection of all Jesus's people. The resurrection itself was both a manifestation of God's justice and a fundamental affirmation by God of the goodness and truth of the created order. This went far beyond Plato's wildest dreams. Indeed, it may be that Plato would have found this barking mad, since it insists that the material world after God's redemption is in fact man's true home. Many Christians, even today, including probably those watching this video, have an understanding of eschatology that is more like Plato than like Paul. It is ethereal, cloudy, and rather disembodied. It involves leaving the world and going far away to a better place. They forget that the mission of Jesus was not so much to take us away from the world, but to bring the kingdom of God to us, to sanctify the world. They forget, among other things, the foremost petition in the foremost prayer that Jesus taught us is, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven."
cdu.edu. All right. So let's make sure that that's shut down. And screen share my PowerPoint again. So I can lecture now a little bit, a little bit on the rest of this subject of Neoplatonic Christianity and put a lot of it in my own words. And by the way, folks, not all of my PowerPoint slides are going to have notes about every little thing that was in the video. So, but there might be questions on your quiz or on the midterm, or for this, it's the final, based on that. So you have to take your own notes about the embedded video, right? I cover most of it, but not all of it. Okay, so Neoplatonist Christianity, right? There's the world below, where human beings are carrying a coffin, right? Where people die. And then there's the world above. So you've got that two worlds thing again, the world above, like as depicted higher up in all the churches of Christianity, these angelic supernatural beings that live in the world where Plato's forms used to live, right? So yes, oh, right. And they didn't make this clear in the video that you just saw, but I want to make it clear now. So getting back to the Neoplatonic metaphysics, I pointed out that there was a trinity there, a threefold distinction in the Godhead, so to speak, in the divine being, which is the one, the Logos, which is the cosmic mind or the consciousness of the one, the intelligibility of it, and then the world soul, right? A soul that fills the world, and the world is the body of the world soul, just like my physical body is the body of my own soul, right? So you've got that Neoplatonic Trinity, but now look at this. We've got the Catholic Trinity. There's the Father in heaven, right? And he's the one in charge of everything. He created everything. Everything comes out of him. When he creates the world, it emanates out of his being, right? Not from somewhere else. He doesn't have a toolkit where he takes pieces and puts them together. No, he manifests the entire world as an act of his own being and will, right? That's the Father. And then it says in the New Testament in John 1.1, meaning the opening line of the gospel according to John, the apostle and disciple of Jesus, in the beginning was the Logos, the Word, and the Word was God, right? And Christians, theologians take that to mean the Word. It says elsewhere in the next passage, or where the Word became flesh, right? And Jesus is the incarnation, the becoming flesh. Carne means meat in Spanish and Italian and something like that in Latin. And incarne is in the flesh, right? And when you incarnate or you reincarnate, you get born in the flesh again, right? So the Word was made flesh. The Logos incarnate is Jesus, right? And then the soul of the world, the spirit or ghost or soul that fills the world, is the Holy Spirit, right? The Spirit of God that fills the entire creation. All right, I don't see anything how you could not see the Platonism in that. Okay. Yes, John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. The Logos. Logos means word, but remember, the arche of logos or nous, it doesn't just mean a word, right? It literally translates as word, but that's just one of the many meanings. Just like the word God has many meanings. There are little gods, Greek gods. There's God with a capital G, and you say, oh, he's the Godfather, or he's the Godfather of soul, or whatever it is, right? So words have multiple meanings. Logos with a capital L means some kind of cosmic principle, an arche, that makes the entire universe rational, intelligible, understandable, well-ordered, structured, and so on, okay? The cosmic mind, the cosmic intelligence, that's the Logos, right? So same two-world metaphysics, right? Angelic beings and disembodied spirits and all sorts of things in God's supernatural world are not visible to us. Every now and then something becomes visible, like in a miracle or a poltergeist or something else like that, right? But according to this metaphysics, you've got the physical world and the superphysical world, or the natural world and the supernatural world, the visible world and the invisible world, right? The world of the spirit. Physical world, just like with Plato, is temporary. This life is temporary, but eternity is forever, right? The life after death is eternal, right? And the physical world is not only temporary compared to the better world, but it's less good and less real, right? This is less real than the eternal world. Spiritual world, heaven, right, is eternal. It's more real. And that woman in the speech there, she said that line in Jesus's prayer, right? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thy will be manifest in the material world as it is in the supernatural world, the natural world and the supernatural world, right? So this two world metaphysics, right? And then the same thing with the idea of transcendence that you had in the Neoplatonic model, right? The soul communes with God, right? And Christian saints and mystics all communicate and commune and feel at one with and connected with God. They feel the Spirit of God come over them or speak within them, the still small voice within. There's so many different versions of this in Christianity, this notion of transcendence. Attaining sainthood is a spiritual enlightenment where you transcend your mere bodily existence and become infused with the spirit that fills the universe, right? Your soul comes to life. It connects with the God, the cosmic soul, or God, or the Holy Spirit, right? So that's another thing that's Platonic. Okay, so they mention the woman, a lot of people call him Augustine, but I'm so used to calling him Augustine or Saint Augustine. I think both ways are correct. He was from a town in North Africa called Hippo, which was in modern day Algeria. Whoops. And there's a picture of him, an old painting of him, but I don't know what century that painting was made in or how historically accurate it's supposed to be, but just take a good look at him. Now I've got two other painting type things of him. Oh, there he is again. I made him bounce back in because there's something emphatically important about that picture. There's another one. They look quite different, these two. That's another painting of St. Augustine or Augustine from Algeria, which is, west of Egypt and east of Morocco, right? It's in North Africa. Of course, it's above the Sahara. It's in the Sahara. In North Africa is Saharan Africa, mostly desert, and sub-Saharan Africa is mostly jungle, right? And there's a difference in the kind of ethnic groups that are in the north, in the Saharan part, the North African part, and then the Central and South African part. And one of the main kind of differences between them is that, like, people from Kenya and Ethiopia and South Africa and all those other countries, right, are much more darker skinned, and the people in the Saharan Africa are much more ethnically related. You could tell by their features to people from the Middle East, the Arabics and people of that sort, right? So there's a kind of racial distinction, but although back then we apparently didn't have a concept of race back then. We had tribes and things like that and ethnic groups, but not the concept of race is relatively 1700s, I think. Okay, so, but look at the two different pictures of him there. And here's the third one. This is one of those stained glass things that you see in the windows in a church, right? I would imagine that the ones that look more white were later ones, and that the one where he looks more African or at least even Egyptian or something like that, dark Middle Easterner or something, is, I think, historically older, but I can't say for sure. But, I went to Catholic school, right, grammar school, and I heard of Augustine or St. Augustine. It never dawned on me that he might have been a person of color until some years ago studying philosophy. Okay, so I just thought I should mention that because there are two greatest Catholic theologians in the history of Catholicism. He was the first, and what's his name? Aquinas was the second, but Aquinas calls himself an Augustinian. All right, so Augustine lived in the 4th century into the 5th, right, of the Common Era. There's a statue of him. He was born as a Christian, like I said, in Hippo, which was an ancient, in the time he was born, it was still a Roman city. Nowadays, there was no Algeria back then. It was Hippo, and different maps were different back then and the way things were carved up. But this was a Roman city. Remember, just like the Greeks took over most of the world, the Romans took over most of the world. Although even when what do you call it? The Greeks took over most of the ancient world, lots of people spoke Greek. I believe the original New Testament was all written in Greek. I believe Jesus probably spoke Greek, even when he spoke with Pontius Pilate when he was a prisoner of the Romans before being crucified. He conversed with Pontius Pilate, but Pontius Pilate, being in some kind of magistrate in charge of Judea, might have spoken Aramaic, which was the native tongue, a kind of Hebrew that Jesus spoke. But I believe Jesus probably spoke to him in what's called Koine, which was the kind of street Greek that everybody spoke because the Greek Empire had been so powerfully influential in that era. And then the Roman Empire, of course, it took centuries, but eventually the Latin language of the Romans created all these Romance languages based on Latin, The original Latin is what the Romans spoke, for those of you who don't know, and Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and even Romanian, named after Rome. It's like Romagna, right? Another Roman province. They're all Romance languages. They're all basically forms of Latin, right? So Latin America and Latinos and Latinas and Latinxes. I'm not sure how to pronounce the plural of that. It's a recent word. We didn't have that one when I went to school. They're all, Latino is a kind of Romano in a sense, right? The language is based on the Romans. All right, so that's a tangent. It's unimportant. You don't have to worry about the languages. All right, I'm just mentioning some history. It's always good to put things in historical context. So yeah, he was born a Christian. He converted for some period of time, I don't know how long, to, this woman mentioned this very quickly in her lecture, but didn't say what Manichaeanism was. Manichaeanism was a religion back then. I think it might have come from Persia. I believe, yes, it came from Persia. And well, it was at least in Persia. I don't know if it came from Persia, but I know that it was one of the many religions in Persia in the ancient world. And the Manichaeans had a belief that there were two forces in the universe, kind of like yin and yang, but kind of like God and a kind of anti-God, or a good God and an evil God, or two aspects of the same God, one good, the other evil. I've heard different versions of this, but often the good was associated with the soul and the spirit, and the evil was associated with the body. And so there was this idea of the good and evil being in an, eternal conflict, and somehow or another escaping the body is the way to escape evil and transcend into the world of the spirit, right? And so there's this weird kind of ideology there, but he was a Manichaean for quite a while, right? Oh, I have notes about that. Yeah. So and then he studied Neoplatonism, and like the woman said in a lecture, he might have been baptized. I guess maybe baptism was a kind of spiritual awakening ritual that wasn't only practiced by Catholics at the time, because she said that the story goes, she said it might have been an exaggeration, but I'm not that much of a historian of religion, but she gave the impression that he might have been baptized before becoming a Christian, baptized as a Neoplatonist, right? That's interesting. In any event, yeah, the more I read about this stuff, the more I want to read about it. It's really interesting. Yeah, so he was a Neoplatonist for a while, or at least believed a lot of what they believed. And then I forget the reason why, but he got converted. Somebody helped, his mom or somebody persuaded him, and he converted to Christianity and was baptized in Milan, Italy. Or maybe that woman wasn't all that clear. Because I read that he was baptized in Milan, but I didn't read that he was baptized as a Neoplatonist. But I guess the point was that even when he was baptized, he was very much a Neoplatonist. And then only when I think that woman in the story said something about, or maybe I read it somewhere else, he met a certain man who persuaded, that guy was from Syria, right? Another Roman province, right? And became a Christian, right? He was in Milan. His mother brought him to Milan in North Italy. It wasn't called Italy back then. All right. He wrote two really great books, The City of God and Confessions. And in The City of God, in the video, she showed a picture of Jerusalem and then this glowing version of the Jerusalem in heaven. That's the City of God. The heavenly version, where all of the good souls and the angels and the Holy Spirit and God, all kind of commune in the divine, supernatural, heavenly city of God, the true Jerusalem, right? Which is like the form of Jerusalem, not the mere earthly reflection of it. There's that Platonic thing once again, right? Oh yeah, so I have that. And when it comes to Confessions, one of my favorite lines from it is when, he says that he wrestles with sin and lust, and he had made friends with men who boasted and bragged and were in competition about how much sex they had with different women. And so he admits that that rubbed off on him. And he was extremely attached, probably in love with like a mistress or a concubine or whatever you want to call her, somebody who was other than the woman that his mother wanted to prearrange his marriage with, right? And when they kind of forced him to break up with her, it broke his heart. But I don't know, what the relationship between that was, what kind of love it was, if it was just lust. But speaking about his desires and his battling with this Manichaean, I guess, attitude towards the body and its desires, right? She talked about his ideas about sex, divine sex, Adam and Eve sex, and all that kind of stuff. He says he had a prayer, God, make me chaste. And to be chaste is to be spiritually pure, without sin, without motive for sin, without temptation from sin, right? Kind of like a spiritual virgin, so to speak, right? Pure soul, right? His prayer was, God, make me chaste, but not too quickly, not yet, not just yet. I'm still having fun, right? It's kind of funny. It's almost like an alcoholic saying, God, please help me break the habit. Let's make believe this is vodka and I'm hooked on it. God, this is killing me, this bad habit, hangovers and everything. God, please give me the strength to stop drinking. Not just yet. Wait a minute. Okay, God, so there's just something kind of really humorous about that. I think it is philosophical, but I won't go into why. All right. Yeah. He was the first great Catholic theologian and philosopher. Well, what's the difference between a theologian and a philosopher? Well, theo means God in Greek, right? And in Dios in Spanish, Dio in Italian, Dieu in French, deity in English, Deva in Sanskrit, like the word diva comes from that, right? There's that language thing. I like to do things with language every now and then, but theo means God, and logian, like from logos, is words about, just like in psychology. So theology is the study of God, right? So if you're a religionist with a philosophical intellect, you will devote your philosophizing to studying the nature of God, right? Or to defending your religion, or, working out the contradictions in your religious belief system or something like that. So you have philosophical activity going on, but it's restricted to theo, to God, right? It's like in Judaism, and this is one of the comparisons I like to make, like the rabbis, the Talmudic scholars. The Talmud is the kind of philosophical dialogues and analyses of the Torah, which is the Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, as the Christians would call it, right? That's highly philosophical, but it's all restricted to the basic tenets of Judaism and the primary beliefs, like there is a God, he gave the Torah to the Jews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So within that framework, philosophy and rationalization and all these other things going on to explain and sort it out and make sense of it and understand it and just to differentiate between it, that's theology, right? It's kind of like philosophy applied not just to religion, but within one's religion is theology, right? But his philosophical theology was so rich philosophically that we consider him a philosopher. Philosophers consider him a philosopher more than they consider him a theologian, right? But he's both, okay? So he's the first great Catholic theologian and possibly the greatest one, right? Because as you can see, he's combining and plucking out the Neoplatonic elements in Christianity and making them even more Neoplatonic. Later on, several centuries later, Aquinas will come along, and he's the number two, historically, chronologically, the second one. Some consider him the greatest one, theologian and philosopher. Aquinas is very much in Christianity what Maimonides was in Judaism and what Al-Ghazali is in Islam, right? Three great theologians, one of each religion. A lot of people compare those three, Aquinas, Maimonides, and Al-Ghazali, because they were closer in time, around the 1100s, 1000, 1100. And this guy here, Augustine, was in the 300s and 400s, right? He gets kind of forgotten. But another difference between two of them is that Augustine was a Platonist and Aquinas, even though he calls himself an Augustinian, right? It's just a kind of follower of Augustine, was more of an Aristotelian. Almost all of Aquinas's writings, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Aristotle in my lecture series on Aristotle. He says, and Maimonides does this too, both of them, they just refer to Aristotle in all their writings as the philosopher with a capital P, right? Like he's the man, he's the Mac Daddy of philosophy, Aristotle. All right, so just a little history here. Oh yeah, there he is. I'm an Augustinian. Okay, so now, none of this was in the lecture from that woman from the Catholic university or wherever that place was. It said EDU, so it's some kind of school, but it seemed like some kind of online thing. In any event, although, like I said, it wasn't in her lecture, and I didn't make you read anything for this because there's a lot to cover here, and I wanted to give you guys a break and just lecture about it. Augustine is the first to address the problem of evil, which you saw the problem of evil when we did Epictetus, right? If God is all powerful, then where does evil come from, right? That kind of thing, right? And we talked about some possible solutions to that back then, like free will and a non-cartoon world, right? If you recall, well, the free will idea came from Augustine, right? I didn't mention that then because it was in the later lecture series, but here we are now. We have Augustine before us, and Augustine, some critics say, invented free will as a doctrine to get God off the hook for the problem of evil, right? Say, oh, why is there evil in the world? If you recall, that's the problem. Like the argument from evil, or the problem of evil for Jews, Christians, and Muslims who believe God is all knowing and all powerful, right? Let me rehearse it. It's not in this slide, but go back to the lecture on Epictetus, not Epicurus, sorry. Epictetus is a Stoic. Epicurus, the Epicurean, right? It was a lecture just about him first, where the problem of evil, that one little paragraph of his, right? So, the atheist takes that idea from him and makes the argument from evil. If there's a God who's all powerful, all knowing, and all good, who therefore has the ability to prevent evil, knows how to do it, being all good wants to do it, then there'd be no evil. Or in short, if there was a God, there'd be no evil. Premise one. Premise two, but there is evil. Conclusion, therefore, there's no such God, right? So back then I said, well, there are some replies that come in the history of philosophy. One of them is free will, right? Well, if God didn't give us free will, we'd be puppets. We wouldn't be real people. We wouldn't be moral agents. Nothing we did would matter. We couldn't, we'd be fake, right? We'd be like puppets or robots, right? And then that's not enough. We need to have really dangerous world. Otherwise, you can't develop courage and generosity and other real virtues. So our free will wouldn't even matter. So us to be real people, we have to have real challenges so that, we could cultivate real virtues or vices of character and become the kind of being we want to become freely on our own. And therefore, given that it's better for us to be people than robots, with our free will, we're going to have sin, and therefore we're going to have evil, right? And we need danger and consequences from nature. Otherwise, nothing matters, right? So that was the theodicy, what you could say about God's goodness or God's righteousness, right? This is a reminder of how these things link up, okay? So now we're hitting this problem. Although Augustine brought up free will to solve the problem of evil, he recognized that there was a problem with God's omniscience, right? Like, it's kind of like he stopped himself, perhaps. I don't know if somebody else made the objection, but because I'm not an Augustinian scholar, but he realized that there was another problem. And I think I might have mentioned this when we did the problem of evil, but it goes like this. Well, if God's all knowing, how could you have free will? Well, why is that a problem? Right? Well, there's this idea in Christianity, and I think maybe even in Judaism, like when God created the world, there was a certain number of souls that were all gathered on Mount Sinai in a Platonic version of it. So there's the Platonism also in the Hebrew Bible, right? And they were all present when the law was given to Moses, even if they weren't incarnate yet, right? But there's this idea running throughout Judaism and Christianity that like God has a divine plan for certain souls, and their names are written in the book of life. These ideas were very explicit in Christianity, maybe in the New Testament, or at least in the doctrines of the church, right? That the book of life, 144,000 souls' names are written in the book of life. Those are the ones who are going to wind up in heaven before they were even born, right? Their names were written in the book of life, eternal life, right? That's a small population. That's like a neighborhood in Queens or something like that, or in Brooklyn, right? So most of us, according to that idea, aren't going to heaven, right? But that was decided before we were born. So that's the idea of fate or destiny, right? And God knows this in advance before you were even created. So if God knows every little sin that you're going to commit before you're even born, before he brings you into existence, and your eternal damnation or your eternal reward was like written in the book before you were even born, because God knows everything. He knows every little detail about the future. Jesus said things like, not a leaf falls from a tree or a hair grows on a kid's head that God doesn't know about, right? God knows everything in advance, right? But if he does, how could your choices matter? How could you have free will, right? So let's formalize this a little bit. God is omniscient, the book of life. Is your name written in it, by the way? What do you think? We call this theological. You know what theological means because I just spent a while talking about it. Precognitivism. Well, if you have a dream that comes true and it's really complicated and not just like a coincidence, we call that precognition. Or if you have a vision of something that comes true, like in the movie Final Destination, right? Every single one of those movies begins with somebody having a vision about what's about to happen, and then they see their death, and then they try to avoid it, but they all die anyway, right? That's destiny. But seeing your destiny before it happens is called precognition. Cognition is knowing something before it happens. Precognition, right? So theological precognition is God's foreknowledge, God's knowing things before they happen. He has foreknowledge of the future, right? The hands there, I can see the future, right? Like in a crystal ball. Time, I can see the future. The future is time, right? So before creating the world, God knows who will win eternal life and who will suffer eternal damnation, etc. Right? Because it's not only about that, it's about every little sneeze, every little hair, every little sin, every little everything, right? Etc. Right? How can we have free will if that's the case? Especially because etc., which is rotating over there. I don't know if you missed it. One of my cheap little graphics tricks. I don't know many of them, but let me back it up so maybe we can see that again. There it is. Whoa, etc. Every little detail that ever happens, all kinds of random little things. Every single detail is part of God's plan, right? Where's the room for free will? Because God can't be wrong, right? God's all knowing. He's all powerful, and he's the perfect being. So everything that he knows, he can't be wrong about one of those leaves falling from a tree or a sneeze or anything else, right? That's the problem. If God knows that you choose X at a certain time, 30 years from now in the future, right? You pick chocolate cake instead of orange juice at the restaurant or whatever it is, right? God already knew that before the universe was created, right? Because God knows everything in advance. How's free will possible? Because you say God knows you chose a chocolate cake, right? But if you really had free will, 30 years from now, you could choose the orange juice. If you really have free will, God can't tell by studying your brain cells or anything else what you're going to choose, right? So, but if God knows you're going to do that, you can't falsify what he knows. So you have to do that. That's the argument, right? So if God really has foreknowledge, if God really knows everything, right, in advance, before the world was created, how could you possibly really have free will? Augustine saw this problem, which makes him a brilliant philosopher. And he tried to solve it. So here's a little diagram. I guess this diagram was written in 1994. But, God created the world at the lower left-hand part of the diagram on the line, right? And some major events, life of Christ, that was the next, you could have put the fall, Adam's fall, Noah, the flood, Abraham, a couple of other prophets, life of Jesus, Jesus on the cross, resurrection, whatever. And this is the Christian model, of course. And then suppose right now it was 1994. Some of you probably, well, none of you were born in 1994. You're college students and high school students in this particular class. And then in the future, you got the final judgment. Remember the book of life. You're going to heaven, you're going to hell. Is your name in the book? Not in the book, right? Are you on the list? Sorry, bud, you're not on the list. You got to take the elevator going down. Right? And then to infinity, that's that little sideways 8 at the end there. This time goes off into eternal future, whatever's going to go on in heaven 8 gazillion years from now, or 8 gazillion years time, 8 gazillion years times 8 gazillion years to the 28th power, right? Whatever's going to happen, what kind of harp music's going to be playing that day, right? God already knows, right? So even your free choices in heaven. So how could they be free, right? That's the idea. Well, in this diagram, like God is a circle with arrows. God doesn't move, but the arrows do. And they kind of remind me of that model of the sun and the rays emanating, where God doesn't change, the one doesn't change, but all the little details swirling around on the peripheral, like hairs moving on the edge of a rug or something like that, right? I'm sorry for the horrible metaphors, but I think that there's something like that going on in this model as well. Okay, so yes, God's crystal ball, he can see the future. He can see which way you were going to go before he even created you, before he even created the world, right? How could your choices be free when God knows what you're going to do, knows where you're going to go? He knew whether your name would be in that book or not, whether that's true or a metaphor, it doesn't matter. It makes the same point, right? If God knew whether or not your name would be in that book before he even created you, it seems like he decided that. He's all powerful, infinitely knowing. How could he be wrong? How could you do anything else? You can't falsify what God knows about you. Can't fool God, right? God is the ultimate version of Final Destination. If you haven't seen any of those movies, you should, just for this one point, right? Like, even if you could see your own future, God let you see it because he knows it, right? There's nothing, you can't get around God. Okay. It's your name's not in the book. That's it. You're going to hell. Okay. Like, whoa, what should I think? So, okay, look, if I really don't have free will, then God is the source of all evil, because there really is evil in the world. Remember, we couldn't get rid of premise 2 in the argument from evil. So if free will doesn't really make sense, like, maybe we need a different argument, not the argument from evil that God doesn't exist, but if God exists and God allows evil in the world, then maybe God is not omnibenevolent, right? Descartes considers that a modern philosopher. Take another class in modern philosophy. We can't go into that today. All right, so we have a dilemma now. Do we really have free will? Can we have free will and God's all-knowing, omniscient? Remember, that means omni means all, and science is not another word for knowledge. God's all-knowing. A dilemma is uno, dos. In Greek, it's dia. Dia is 2. Dia, dilemma. A lemma is a branch. 2 branches, dilemma. So we could have free will, or we could have all-knowing of God, but can we have both? It doesn't, like, it looks like if we have free will, then God can't know what we're going to do. But if God really can know what we're going to do, then we don't really have free will. We can have one or the other, but we can't have both. But the religion requires both, because the religion says God's not only all-knowing, but he gave us free will and he's all good, right? So, like, but wait a second, we have to have free will. Otherwise, God's not all good, because then evil comes from him, not from us, not from our free will. Remember theodicy, the defense of God's goodness. So do you see how the problem of God's knowledge is tied into the problem of evil? Augustine kind of invented, or at least philosophically discovered, the doctrine of free will. It doesn't mean we didn't have free will all along. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't, but the Bible presupposes it because it seems immoral to punish us if we don't have free will, right? That's another problem over here, right? With the fall from Adam's eating the fruit. And if he didn't have free will when he ate the fruit, he's a puppet, right? So then it's all God's fault, but God's punishing us for what he chose. Right. So I know I'm saying a lot of this fast, but you see how all these problems are interrelated, and Augustine tried to solve them all, right? By talking about Adam, Eve, and the fall, and all these subtle, really philosophically interesting ways to try to get around it. But let's just stick with this one, the dilemma between free will and omniscience, or all-knowingness, right? So can the following two propositions, which is another fancy word for statements or claims, can they both be true? Are they compatible, or are they contradictory? Are they consistent or inconsistent? Consistent and compatible, or inconsistent and incompatible? If they're consistent, that means they can both be true. If they're compatible, that means they can both be true. If they're inconsistent or contradictory or incompatible, that means they can't both be true. Okay? That's what a dilemma is. So proposition one, you choose absolutely freely. Nothing persuades you or causes you or forces you to make the choice that you make, right? Free will on this conception is you're absolutely free. For you to be absolutely morally responsible for what you do, you have to be absolutely free, completely free, right? It has to be completely up to you what you chose, nobody else, just you. Okay, that's proposition one. You truly have free will means you choose absolutely freely. Proposition two, God knows absolutely, impeccably, incorrigibly, he cannot be wrong about what you will choose. God's absolutely certain, and he's correct to be certain, and he can't possibly be wrong when he knows exactly what you're going to choose before you're even born, right? Now, that's proposition one and proposition two. Can they both be true? Right? Well, we call the doctrine that they can both be true theological compatibilism, right? They're both compatible, both can be true at the same time. Augustine tries to show that they are. He's a compatibilist. Or incompatibilism. Well, if they're not compatible, then the whole theology falls apart. So does the theodicy, the defense of God's goodness, right? So believers have to go with option one, that they're both compatible, right? They can't be incompatibilists. All right, which position does Augustine take? Well, I think you could answer that by now. He has to say that they can both be true. How does he do it? What's his argument for theological? That should say theological compatibilism. I'm going to have to fix that, and I'm going to see if I can do it right now by, no, I have to hit the escape button. Yeah. I don't know if you're still watching this, but hold on. I'm going to save that. Give me a moment. I can't leave that in the notes because then somebody will blame it on me. Where's my screen share thing? There it is. Okay, screen share. Sorry about that, folks. Now let's play from the current slide. Okay, good. We're back in business. What's Augustine's argument for the claim that they're compatible, free will and God's foreknowledge or omniscience or all-knowingness? If a choice is absolutely free, then absolutely nothing determines it, so nothing can be an indicator of what it's going to be. Oh, I should have left that as incompatibilism. Oh, yeah. All right, pay attention. Don't just, I'm going to fix it again, but I'll do it later at the end of the slide. So I make sure I know what the hell I'm doing here. All right, yeah, if the choice was absolutely free, like the fork in the road, and nothing determines which way you're going to go, then you're giving no clues by your behavior to anyone else monitoring you, then like nothing can be an indicator of what your choice is going to be. Right now, if you're ever behind somebody driving and you watch the way they drive, you might be able to figure out, oh, he's about to try to get in the lane in front of me. That's different. Right. That's, just kind of trying to figure out what somebody's going to do. And some people say God's so smart, he can figure out anything without interfering with you or whatever. But let me make the argument again. So if there's any way to truly know what the choice is going to be, and that's not just a good guess, like when you try to predict because you make that prediction that he's going to try and get in my lane and then he doesn't, right? So, right, that's not absolutely reliable, right? But if there was an actually reliable sign and it's not a good guess, but it's actual knowledge about what they're going to do, then there's something that necessitates the choice. Meaning you see that sign, then if you see that sign, then that necessitates or guarantees that that person is going to do X, right? Then it's not really absolutely free, right? So it's like either there's no sign and therefore no way to know, right? And therefore truly absolutely free, or there is a sign which is a reliable indicator of what the choice is going to be, and then the choice is not absolutely free, right? It can't be both. So yeah. But if that's the case, right? So like the upper diagram where the fork in the road is open, right? That's totally free. The bottom one, if you could predict which way he's going to go, then he's some kind of puppet. There's something controlling him. He's not in control. He's not free. Something else is controlling, pulling the strings on his choices, right? So let me go back again and fix that because it is supposed to be incompatibilism, right? That's an argument for the two things not being compatible. So I apologize for that. Okay, hold on. I had a problem here. Let's play from the current slide again. Okay, good. So that's still working. So yeah, this is what I did already. Let me move on to the next one. So now, all right. So first I wanted to make the argument why there's a serious problem. If they're not compatible, this is bad news for the belief system, for the religion. Okay, so here's Augustine's clever argument around this problem. He says, well, here's the proposition. Suppose Joe freely chooses X. Some random guy, Joe, chooses X, whatever. He chooses the lemon pie instead of the coconut custard pie at the diner or whatever. It doesn't matter what X is. It's a choice that he freely chooses, right? Now we'll call the proposition P, Joe freely chooses X, right? We're calling that P. So if God knows that that proposition is true, right, then that proposition must be true before God can know it, right? It has to be true for him to know it, because one of the criteria for knowledge on a simple analysis of it is if I know something, X or P, then X or P or whatever it is, it has to be true. I can't know something that's false. I can't know that 2 + 2 is 18, right? I can know that 2 + 2 is 4, but for me to know it, 2 + 2 has to actually be 4, right? Or 1 + 1 has to actually be 2 in order for me to know that 1 + 1 is 2. Can't know something that's false, so it has to be true for me to know it. So its truth is logically prior to me knowing it, okay? So here's this little diagram. Forget the guy in the picture. He's irrelevant. It's the arrows and the words that matter here, right? So God's foreknowledge is chronologically prior to the thing that he knows, because God existed before he created the world and he knew everything. However, the event is logically prior, that's the right side of the screen, to God's knowing it. In other words, what I just said, the statement about the event that Joe freely chooses X, that has to be true in order for God to be able to know it, right? So maybe in some way, God creates the world, sees the entire future, sees that it's true. He has to see that it's true. It has to be true for God, even God, to see that it's true, right? So logically, its truth is prior to God's knowing it, right? It has to be true for God to be able to know it. That makes it the truth of the event or the description of the event is logically prior to God's knowing it on the right side of the screen. On the left side of the screen, though, chronologically, if God knows everything before he creates the universe, he imagines the whole thing in his mind, can't be wrong about it because he knows everything, right? And that's chronologically prior to him creating the world. So you've got these two different things, right? Okay, so it was just sorting out the problem for you, right? So once again, if God knows that P, then P must be true before God knows that P. Otherwise, God can't know it. It has to be true for him to know it, right? But Augustine said, God's knowing it chronologically in advance, right? And it's having to be true before God can know it. None of that makes it the case right? That Joe has to choose X, right? God's chronologically knowing it before he creates the world, and it's logically being, it has to be true that the thing is true for God to know it. Neither of those things are what make Joe choose X. Joe still freely chooses X, right? In fact, Augustine, and here's the really tricky thing. Augustine says, if God knows proposition P, and God can't be wrong, anything that God knows must be true. So if God knows proposition P, then God knows that Joe freely chooses X. And if God knows that Joe freely chooses X, then it can't be wrong that Joe freely chooses X. Really brilliant. Might be sleight of hand, logically speaking, but it'd be hard to kind of spell out how that works, right? Nor does it prevent Joe from choosing not X. That little squiggly minus sign, the tilde sign, means not in logical notation, right? That doesn't prevent Joan. Like if Jones freely chose X, that means he could have equally freely chosen not X. God's knowing about it isn't what stops him from choosing not X. Nothing stops him except him himself. His free choice to not do X, but to do X is what stops him from not doing X and starts him from doing X. Get it? Okay, so that's Augustine's brilliant analysis. It guarantees his free choice because God can't be wrong. God knows that he freely chooses X. Okay, so Augustine is implying it's not that God knows Joe must choose X. If God knew that Jones must choose X, then that would be undermining Jones's free will, right? That wouldn't even, Jones wouldn't have a will if he must do what God knows him to do or something like that, right? Rather, God knows that Joe will do X or that Jones does choose X at the time when he does it, right? So there's a slight little bolding going on with the word must and will or does in the two different sentences, but you can't see it that much because it's white on black. All right. It's not, and Augustine makes this brilliant point, it's not even God's foreknowledge that doesn't interfere. If you have a vision that something's going to happen that involves somebody making a choice, your vision isn't, stopping them from making the other choice. You just somehow or another transcend time and see that the person does it, right? Anyone's foreknowledge, anyone's precognition doesn't interfere with someone else's free will, right? That's Augustine's point, and that's brilliant. And that's why I have a picture of this from an old movie. That's a time machine. I think that might even be the name of the movie. I don't remember what movie I got this from. But think of this. This is my example. If you could get in a time machine and go a month into the future and see what like your best friend picks for dinner at the restaurant, right? And then come back and get out of the time machine and write it down. He'll have, the chickpea salad with the onions. He'll have a little bit of beets. He'll have a breadstick. He'll say this, he'll sneeze at this time. And you write all these things down, right? And you seal it, mail it, gets the postmark, and you hold on to it. And then that day after he goes to the restaurant, he comes back, you open it up and you tell him, look, see, I told you what you were going to do, right? Does that undermine the guy's free will who chose the chickpeas and the beets and the breadstick and all that? No, right? Could it be wrong? No, if you went to the future, you saw that he actually did that, right? Somehow, if time travel was possible, maybe it's not, but suppose hypothetically, for the sake of the argument, that it was, right? You're seeing it, like Augustine said, it's not just God's foreknowledge, anybody's foreknowledge. So if you could travel into the future, right, and see what somebody did, and then know that they were going to do it before they actually did it because you traveled in time, that doesn't interfere with their free choice, right? Even if you can't be wrong, you've got guarantees that your time machine is perfect and all that kind of thing, right? So that's a really pretty clever argument. That's one of the reasons why I think I would say, as great as he is in theology, he's just as good, if not greater, in philosophy, Augustine, right? So once again, difference is maybe with your time machine, there's something wrong. There's variables that it doesn't take into account. Someone else's time machine can go in and interfere with him, and he winds up bumping into somebody and changes his mood, and he doesn't have the chickpeas, right? But God could see all that, but you with your time machine, you can't, right? So, but when God sees the future, he can't be wrong, right? So, but the guy in the time machine is a model for us to understand, like, God is outside of time, by the way, right? So there's a sense in which God can see all times simultaneously because he's outside of time and he knows everything. It's like a DVD movie, right? Where you record everybody doing everything in the history of the universe, and it's on a DVD, and every moment of it is a freeze frame because God's outside of time and he could see all of them and how they all interconnect, even though he's not interfering with it. He sees the future before it happens because he's outside of time and it doesn't interfere with anything. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Okay, oh yeah, model, God's outside of time, right? So this is similar to models in physics where there's 3 dimensions of physical space, like in a cube, right? A square only has 2 dimensions, height and width, right? But a cube has depth. That's the 3rd dimension, right? So some physicists say time is a 4th dimension, and there's up to 10 different dimensions, right? What if God somehow or another is like that Logos kind of guy, outside of all of those at the highest dimension? So then he could see all the other dimensions all at the same time, or he could see all of time, like the arrow there, event A, event B, God could see it all, like those little images, frozen DVD time slices, right? He's outside of time. There's like a mind like God. God's like outside the universe, and zip, he sees everything. And just a little picture to make you think. And I think there's still an objection that the atheist could make, coming back to the problem of evil. Okay, so look, this is an interesting one. Let me back up before I even go into the details and say what the problem is. If God knows in advance whose name's going to be written in the book of life before he creates them, right? And then being sent to hell forever, that's eternal for a couple of mistakes in a blink of an eye, which is a lifetime. A lifetime is a blink of an eye in eternity, right? If God foresees that if I create Rick Rapetti, he's going to sin in some certain ways, that he's going to wind up in hell forever. Not a bad guy, but he's really screwed up those 3 times, and that was a real big screw up. There's just no forgiving that, whatever it is. So he's going to hell, right? Like a compassionate God, like, I don't know, like if I was God, I know how heretical that is, and there was a time I'd probably get burnt at the stake for joking around like this. But like if I was God, right? Maybe, I'm not saying I would, but maybe if I was all good and all knowing and all powerful, and I saw that poor little Rapetti was going to wind up in hell forever, and he's not such a bad guy, right? I might just say, you know what, like if I create him, he's going to have to live. I'm going to see how that's going to go. I can see the whole thing. You know what? I just won't create him. I'll spare him from that. Like him having that blink of an eye of fun, this is just drop in a bucket. It's not worth that eternal suffering he's going to go through. So let me spare the poor guy. I'm just not going to bring him into existence. I have the power. I'm God, right? So if I'm really all that loving and compassionate, and I know everything, and I know that's going to happen, I'll just spare Rapetti. We'll get some other philosophy teacher to enlighten these kids, right? So okay. So that's another problem of evil, right? If God knows the entire future, right? Well, it doesn't harm. Like if I never existed, if God chose never to bring me into existence, he's not harming me, right? It harms me, no non-existing being, to not be brought into existence, to be given life, because he doesn't exist yet. So you can't lose anything if you don't exist, right? It's kind of like Parmenides thinking about nothing. A nothing can't suffer the failure to become a something because it's a nothing, right? In God's mind, it's a hypothetical possible something, but that's not the same as a something, okay? Yeah, non-existing beings can't complain. Like the imaginary Repeti in God's mind can't say, hey, wait a minute, God, give me a chance, Only existing beings can complain if their lives overall aren't worth living and they're better off not having lived. The angry kid who thinks their life stinks is, yeah, I wish you didn't give me life. And why'd you make me come into this world? I wish I didn't exist, right? And I don't mean to, that could be a touchy subject, but, most of the time when kids complain like that, why did you give birth to me if I'm not going to, I'm going to be poor and I'm not so smart or so handsome or so strong or whatever it is, right? I'm sure almost every kid at one point or another thought something like that, right? So we're God's kids on this model, right? But unless he brings us into existence, we can't complain like, gee, man, why'd you bring me into existence? My life is so bad, I'd have been better off not living. But if I commit suicide, I'm going to hell, right? But we can only even complain about our lives. Like the issue is it worth creating this being? Is his life going to be, or her life going to be worth living? Socrates, the only life worth living is the examined life. Maybe not, right? So like the point is, unless you have life, you can't even make that complaint, right? God knew who'd get eternal damnation. He harmed them in a sense by giving them life. That's a different argument from evil. It's a different argument from evil, right? If the theology is true and God knows whose names won't be in the book of life before he still gives them life, then God brought into existence beings who he knew would suffer eternal damnation because of their ignorance or stupidity, or they couldn't control their desires, or whatever it is that qualifies you for hell or disqualifies you from heaven. All right. This is a little picture over there with God and some poor guy who's a skeleton who's chosen to be eternally damned. Guess you're just flat out of luck, right? Well, no. According to this, God could have prevented that from happening, right? Why didn't he do it? Like I said, if Repeti was God, he'd be more gracious and merciful and wouldn't bring in those poor people into existence. Okay, some other objections and replies. I know we're going far afield from Christianity, but it's all connected in Christianity, right? Well, God's just testing us. Life is a test. If Eve hadn't yet eaten the fruit of good and evil, or Adam, why did God expect her or Adam to know it was evil to disobey him? This is another problem, right? Just the command in itself, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? You wind up in heaven or hell if you're good or evil, right? So the whole problem of God not wanting you to know the difference and where you're going to wind up, that's another can of worms. As for God was testing Abraham to see if he would kill his own son, who him and Sarah waited like 100 years to have. What kind of test is that? God knows the outcome. That's the point. God knew the outcome of the test. So why put the poor guy through it if he knew the outcome, right? And also it says in the Bible that God kind of looked down upon the earth after the big flood with Noah and all that and felt bad and said, yeah, I think I overreacted. I'm putting it in my own words, but God experienced some kind of remorse after the flood. But didn't he know he would feel that in advance? This is a problem with God's foreknowledge. Plagues, right? All the plagues and all the horrible suffering of all, didn't God know that he'd have to do that in advance too? So here's the last cartoon. There's God. He's like a scientist with test tubes in a lab. There's humans. He's making a concoction. He's got free will. He's thinking about putting it in. And then like, well, maybe free will did cause everything to get all screwed up. Wonder if God had any second thoughts about free will. All right, I'm just trying to be humorous a little bit at the end because we are at the end now. So let me stop the share and pull this thing together and shut it down. This was the longest lecture this week. I apologize for the length, but I believe it was interesting and I hope you do too. And I hope you have the free will to decide whether or not you got anything from this. All right, I'll see you.